There we go, easy now.
You're okay.
Would you believe that a Bigfoot once saved a man's life, and then stayed to keep him warm for 3 days? In the frozen wilderness of Montana, where even your breath turns to ice, a mother creature stood still all night, sacrificing her own warmth to keep her baby from drowning beneath the thinning lake ice. The truth is, Bigfoot isn't the savage beast most believe it to be. Calvin Rowe, a solitary woodsman haunted by loss, broke the sacred code of the forest when he tried to save a dying creature, and in return, she saved him. This story comes from the private journals of the only man to live through a real encounter like this. A man who was given something most people never get from the wild: trust. In the next few moments, you'll learn why a Bigfoot mother handed her child to a human, what made her ancient tribe watch but not punish, and how a lonely man finally found redemption in the eyes of a creature no one believes exists. Yes, this truly happened. Montana, winter of 1989. When Calvin found her standing over a crack in the ice, he thought she was just lost. But she was protecting her child, and when he fell in trying to help, she pulled him out. That day, a silent bond was born. Between man and myth, trust and trauma, warmth and wilderness. If you skip this video, you might miss one of the rarest stories ever told about what happens when a human chooses to stay and repay a life debt to something wild. But if you stay, we promise this story will stay with you. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from today? What's your name, dear listener? How far can this story travel? Across mountains, oceans, and screens? Just by you being here. If you felt something stir inside you, hit like, subscribe, and let's build a community of those who still believe. Not just in Bigfoot, but in second chances, in quiet heroes, and in the kind of stories that remind us the wild remembers kindness. The sun hadn't fully broken the spine of the ridge when Calvin Rowe stepped off the gravel shoulder and onto the old logging road. The frost still clung to the pine needles like a warning. Cold had settled in his joints overnight. Quiet, stubborn cold. But he didn't complain. He never did. He adjusted the strap of his canvas pack, checked the sky for signs of new weather, and started the slow walk toward the frozen lake. Every winter this trail shifted. Logs sank deeper, snow pressed down the undergrowth, water rerouted beneath old culverts until spring pushed everything awake again. But Calvin knew the path like he knew the corners of his own cabin. It was maintenance season, and the Forest Service expected their eyes on the ground. He was one of those eyes. Not the fastest anymore, but steady, thorough. And this mountain? He respected it, even when it didn't return the courtesy. Halfway to the overlook, he paused. Something about the silence caught him. It wasn't bird song missing. Those had quieted weeks ago. But the absence of wind. No creak of trees, no scuffle of squirrels. Just air, dense and watching. Then he saw the tracks. Wide. Too wide for elk, too deliberate for bear. And they didn't follow a path of chase or escape. They circled, wide arcs near the lake's edge, doubling back, pausing, like something had stood guard, like something had waited. The ice near the far end was different. It sagged in a long, pale streak, like something heavy had been dragged across it under moonlight. Calvin squinted. The surface bore faint lines, etched by claws or nails, but not gouged in desperation. More like resistance, or discipline. He moved forward slowly, instinct pulling from some deep place beneath reason. The kind of place that remembered how to listen with your breath. When he reached the shoreline, he saw it. At first, it looked like a log, dark, unmoving, part submerged. Then he saw the rise of a shoulder, the dark matted fur pressed beneath the translucent ice. The arch of a back too large for anything he'd ever logged or reported. The shape didn't thrash. It didn't call, but it was alive. And then it turned its head. Calvin didn't move. Not at first. He just stared, breath locked behind his teeth. The creature's eyes met his, brown, rimmed with frost, but clear. Not pleading, not fearful, just waiting. It had fallen through. No, not fallen, chosen. Because just behind it, under the ice and further in the lake, was something smaller. Barely a shadow, barely moving. He stepped closer and the ice groaned. The large figure tensed, but didn't flee. Its arms were splayed back, anchoring against the cracks, holding, keeping the rest of the ice from caving in. Calvin knelt at the edge, heartbeat loud in his ears. God! His voice didn't travel far. He scanned the lake surface, measured the distance, the tension in the ice. The smaller figure under the surface twitched. Just once. Enough. He had tools, not many, but enough to try. Years ago, he'd stood in a hospital hallway with blood on his shirt and nothing in his hands. He had arrived minutes too late. A flat line. A still child. His wife hadn't blamed him with words, but her silence rang louder than any accusation. Not again. He laid his pack down slowly, unlatched the small axe. It wasn't meant for rescue, but it was all he had. The creature's eyes followed every motion. I'm not here to hurt, he said quietly, not expecting understanding, but needing to say it. He stepped onto the ice. It protested beneath his boots. Calvin moved in a crawling squat, spreading his weight. His breath misted in short clouds. He aimed first near the trapped arm, striking just enough to fracture, not shatter. Each hit vibrated through his bones. The creature didn't flinch. Hours passed. Maybe minutes. Time warped when you begged it not to. He broke through near the creature's hip, widening the space with his hands. The ice cut into his knuckles. He didn't stop. The cold sank deeper, bit his knees, climbed his spine. The last section needed one more blow. He raised the axe, swung. The surface beneath him cracked with a sound like a rib breaking. Then he fell. Cold swallowed everything. He didn't scream. The water forced itself into his mouth too fast for that. It punched his chest, crushed breath from his lungs, turned his limbs to stone. He kicked, but the weight of his coat dragged him. He reached out. Nothing but black water above. Ice closing again. He was going to die. Right here. At the edge of doing the right thing. Again. Then a blur. A shape, a hand, not a hand. Bigger. It pierced the surface and closed around his coat collar, dragging him up with strength that didn't belong to anything man-made. Air ripped into his lungs as he broke surface. He coughed, body spasming. But he was out. He was alive. The bank met his back with frozen mud. Then he was being pulled. Not far. Just far enough that the wind couldn't find him. The creature, wet, gasping, dragging herself from the hole, moved beside him. She didn't run. She didn't roar. She knelt, huge, trembling. Her fur clung to her ribs, dripping. Her breath came shallow, ragged. He blinked up at her, body shaking uncontrollably. She reached out, massive hand hovering above his chest. Not touching, just measuring, counting maybe. He could feel her listening. Then gently she tapped a rhythm. 2, 2, 1. Pause. 2 again, a heartbeat pattern. His. She repeated it, guiding. Breathe. He did. Then again. The fire never came. Not from friction. That would take time neither of them had. Instead, she rose, stumbled into the trees, and returned minutes later carrying a bundle wrapped in bark and moss. A coal inside. Still warm. Carried from some place that had burned long before them. She built a fire with care, with knowledge. Not like a beast. The warmth rose slowly. He curled near it, close to the heat, close to her. The wind outside the trees whined and gave up. He looked at her. At the way she hunched beside the child she'd carried through ice, now laid beside him. A little body, still, but breathing. I'm sorry, he whispered. Not knowing if it was for her or for the past, or for all the times he hadn't arrived in time. She didn't answer. But she didn't leave. He drifted toward sleep, half-conscious. Somewhere in the deep dark of trees, a sound echoed. A deep knock. Not sharp, not a hunter's call. A warning, a summons. She stiffened. Her eyes turned toward it. Calvin heard it too. Felt it in his bones. Not thunder, not accident. Something coming, something watching. But tonight, beside a fading fire and a silent mountain guardian, he wasn't alone. Not yet. The fire had gone low, just embers and ash now. Calvin lay curled beside it, soaked, lungs raw from the water he'd coughed up hours earlier. His coat clung to him like a second skin, heavy and cold, and every breath scraped his chest like pine needles dragged across wet stone. He wasn't shivering anymore. That scared him more than the cold. When he stirred, something massive shifted behind him. Not the wind, not a log creaking, breathing. He opened one eye. The creature hadn't left. It knelt in the dark just a few feet away, its fur still damp, its chest rising and falling in slow, labored rhythm. It watched him, not like a predator, but with the wary patience of something that knew it shouldn't be here, but stayed anyway. She was older than he'd thought. The weight in her gaze, the way she held herself low to the earth, it wasn't fear, it was restraint. Like she was waiting for permission to leave but wouldn't take it unless given. Calvin coughed again, doubled over. The pain lanced through his ribs and spine like the cold had carved a second skeleton inside him. She shifted forward, her huge hand moving to his side. Not touching, not yet, just near. Then slowly, she turned herself so that her back was to the wind. She crouched lower. Her thick shoulder settled like a wall behind him, blocking the gusts as if she'd done this before. He blinked in disbelief. She was shielding him. Not out of instinct, out of intent. Calvin laid back down, exhausted. The warmth of her mass changed the air. Not by much, but enough. And then, her hand moved again. Closer this time. She touched his chest lightly, the pads of her fingers almost hesitant. She held them there, waiting. A pause. Then she tapped. Tap, tap, tap. A beat. A rhythm. Calvin recognized it. His own heart, weak but steady. She was listening to the pulse under her hand. Then she repeated the taps, slow and even. Encouraging, guiding. He exhaled, matched her rhythm. Again and again. Tap, tap, tap. He followed. She wasn't trying to save him like an animal might protect its young. She was calibrating him, holding him in place until his own body remembered what to do. After a few more breaths, she withdrew her hand and rose. Her movements were slow, strained. She'd burned everything already. Her steps toward the tree line wobbled. Still, she vanished without a sound, swallowed by the woods like a breath pulled from the fire. Calvin tried to sit up but fell back with a grunt. His legs were stiff, his skin burning with the first signs of frostbite. Then, from the shadows, she returned. In her arms, a bundle, bark-wrapped. She peeled it open with the care of someone handling a living thing. Inside, nestled in moss and leaf and something blackened from long ago, glowed the faintest red. Coals. She had carried fire, not made it, not rubbed sticks like a folk tale. No, she had remembered where warmth still lived, miles off, and brought it here. She placed the bundle carefully near the pit. She layered dry grasses, old roots, pine resin, bits of curled birch bark. She blew, not wild, but controlled, like a person might. The flame came back. Calvin stared. Every movement of hers defied something he thought he knew. She didn't bask in the fire. She didn't flinch from it. She watched it the way someone watches a friend sleep. Then she knelt again, not far from where the child still lay. He hadn't looked yet, couldn't, but when the wind shifted, he smelled something faint. Not smoke, something alive. He turned his head. The baby, barely longer than his arm, was still, but its chest moved. Shallow, but present. Blanketless, cold-bitten, but not dead. The mother didn't look at Calvin anymore. Her full focus was on the little one. She cupped both hands gently around its middle, not lifting, just enclosing, giving her own heat. Calvin pulled his coat tighter, grimacing as pain flared in his side. He took a shaky breath, then another. The fire was doing its work, but slowly. He found himself staring at her again. This giant, this impossible creature, was trembling. Not violently, but steadily. She hadn't eaten, she hadn't slept, she hadn't stopped. She was going to break. And still, she held the fire. She kept it lit. Because of him. Because now, there was a debt. It wasn't said. It wasn't even shown in the way people might show it. But Calvin had lived long enough to know what it felt like when someone made the choice to stay. Not because they had to, but because they owed. He closed his eyes for just a second. Let the warmth crawl into his bones. "I won't forget," he murmured. Though the words barely reached the air, she didn't blink. The night stretched long. At some point, hours or minutes later, a sound echoed through the trees. A knock. Low, distant, too deep for woodpecker, too deliberate for falling branch. It rolled through the forest like the bass of a drum with no skin. Calvin flinched. The mother didn't, but her body shifted. She rose, turned toward the sound. Ears perked, not afraid, alert. Something had called. Not for help, for witness. Another knock answered, deeper, barely audible. Her spine straightened. She looked back at the child, then to Calvin. She knew what had been broken, not the ice. The law. Still, she didn't run, and neither did he. The fire between them burned just a little brighter. Somewhere beyond the trees, the mountain was listening, watching, waiting. But tonight, it said nothing else. The wind had shifted overnight. It no longer screamed through the branches or clawed at the tents of silence that stretched across the clearing. It breathed, low and steady, as if the mountain itself were sleeping with one eye open. Calvin Rowe stirred under the thin wool blanket, aching from cold that had soaked into every joint and settled like regret. The fire had long died down to a crescent of ash and smoldering coal. For a brief moment, he thought it had all been a dream, one of those strange, fever-born visions that sometimes found men who spent too many winters alone in high country. Then he looked up. The creature was gone. He sat up too fast, the pain in his ribs sharp enough to steal his breath. The place where she'd crouched was empty. Her massive prints remained in the soil, pressed deep like stone memories. He turned, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Then something caught his eye. A drag line, just beyond the ice. Fresh. Parallel grooves carved through half-frozen mud and pine needles. He didn't think, he just moved. The trail led away from the lake, across a small bank of black spruce, and down toward the lowland edge of the timber basin. The kind of terrain where snow lingered longer than it should, and the sun barely touched the ground. He followed the tracks through a world still wet with winter's last breath. Boots slipping in muck, branches whipping against his coat. About 100 yards out, he stopped. There, beneath a leaning cedar that had splintered in last season's windstorm, was a hollow in the earth. Not dug, but shaped, like something had pushed the ground open with the care of a mother tucking in a child. Inside the hollow, the small one lay. It was barely moving, curled in on itself, face pressed into a nest of damp moss and needles, its skin dark and rough, but stretched too thin across bones. Calvin crouched, heart pounding, not from fear now, but from the sheer weight of seeing something so small survive something so brutal. Behind him, he heard a branch snap. He turned. She was there, the mother. She was worse than before. Her chest heaved, her fur matted with ice and old blood. Her eyes, dark, focused, never left her child. She stood like a sentinel, one hand pressed to the tree beside her for balance, the other hanging loose but ready. Calvin stepped aside, slowly, giving her space. She didn't move. Instead, she looked at him, long, measured. Then, as if deciding something ancient, she stepped toward the hollow. Her foot sank slightly in the mud. Calvin stepped closer to the little one. He couldn't help it. It wasn't just dying. It was freezing to death. He pulled a rag from his coat pocket and reached for its face, meaning only to wipe the dirt, to see it more clearly. His fingers brushed across the small forehead, crusted with something like dried clay, reddish-brown, earth mixed with sap. Then he wiped, just once. The mother let out a low sound. Not loud, but enough. He looked up. She had gone rigid. Her breath hitched. Her eyes flared with something that wasn't rage, but deep, bone-deep alarm. He looked back at the spot on the baby's brow. Gone, the mark. He hadn't seen it before for what it was. Not just dirt, not blood, a mark. Something ceremonial. He'd wiped it clean. He cursed under his breath. I didn't mean... But words were useless. She took a step back. Her hand went to her chest, then her head, then slowly down to the ground. A gesture. Calvin didn't understand it. Not fully, but it wasn't a threat. He looked at the child. It whimpered once, a thin sound. He couldn't let it die. Not out here. Not when warmth was just over the ridge. Not when he'd already lost too much in his life to know the shape of regret when it came for the helpless. He unfastened the old canvas sling he kept for hauling gear and knelt beside the hollow. He glanced at her. I'll take him. To the cabin. Her body didn't move. Just her eyes. Watching. Waiting. He wrapped the small frame in the sling. Careful. Gentle. The baby stirred but didn't fight. He tied it tight across his chest like he'd once seen mountain women do with their own. He rose slowly. Still she didn't move. Then, in one fluid motion, she stepped forward and placed her open hand on his chest, the same spot she had touched before. Then, slowly, she pressed 2 fingers to his sternum, then to her own, then back again. Permission. A moment passed between them. Then she let go. He nodded, not trusting his voice. The way back to the cabin was steep, but not long. The mud sucked at his boots. His arms ached from the weight. He slipped once, caught himself with a curse, then pressed on. Behind him, she followed. Not close, not with tension, but like a shadow that belonged there. At the ridge, the first glimpse of the cabin peeked through the trees. Then he froze. Boot prints. Not his. Too narrow. Too fresh. More than one set. Leading toward the clearing, not away. Someone else had been here. Maybe still was. He didn't shout. Didn't curse. Just stood there breathing through his nose. The child against his chest let out a soft grunt. A half-dreamed breath. The mother stepped up behind him, her body now close enough to cast a shadow over his. She saw the prints. She knew. He didn't have a choice now. He adjusted the strap, wiped the sweat from his neck with the back of his hand, and started down. They had to reach shelter before the world caught up. And when it did, nothing would be the same. Not for him. Not for them. Not for whatever old law had just been broken between man and mountain. The cabin stood like a forgotten outpost, its wood darkened by years of storms and silence. No smoke from the chimney yet. No sign of life except the faint crunch of Calvin's boots breaking the frost crust along the path. He moved slowly, the sling heavy against his chest. The small body inside barely stirred, but it was warmer now. Not warm, just not dying. Behind him, the mother moved with care. Her steps light for something so massive, always 10 paces back, never closer unless the child stirred or whimpered. That sound seemed to erase all distance in a breath. Calvin reached the door. Unlocked. He pushed it open with one shoulder and stepped into the stale air of winter-held wood. He hadn't been up here more than twice this season. Maybe 3. It was meant to be a ranger relay stop. One of those Forest Service stations they left stocked and quiet until someone needed it. Maps, canned food, an old CB radio that hadn't buzzed in months. A place for men like him, maintenance guys, watchers, quiet men who kept things working that no one noticed until they broke. He laid the bundle on the cot gently, unwrapped the sling, layer by layer. The infant stirred. A weak noise, faint but real. He set water to warm on the small pot-belly stove, stoked the fire back to life with old pine and bark, and watched the flames crawl back into the iron belly. The heat crept into the floorboard slowly, like something remembering how to move. Then he turned. She stood in the doorway, filling it. Her head nearly touched the top frame, one hand on the post, the other bracing something in her palm, a small bundle of roots, damp, fragrant, fresh picked from the woods. She didn't enter. She laid it gently by the door, then pulled her hand back. No sound, no eye contact, just a gesture, an offering, not gratitude, not trade, balance. He didn't speak, just watched her fade back into the gray edge of the tree line, the mist curling behind her like smoke, as if the woods themselves were reclaiming her. Inside, he turned to the child. He wrapped it in a wool shirt, thick enough to swaddle, thin enough to breathe. Its eyes fluttered once, then again, but not in panic, just slow, adjusting to light, to warmth, to something not frozen. He remembered that feeling, holding someone small, not his own, not for years, but the reflex came back like muscle memory, a hand behind the neck, a touch to the wrist, feeling for breath, for rhythm. He tapped his knee gently, just an old habit, a motion to soothe himself more than anything. The child's ear twitched, then it stilled, as if that sound meant something to it, as if it had heard it before, through the skin of someone holding on for dear life. The fire caught deeper. Flames leaned brighter, casting flickers of gold against the log walls. The space changed. It wasn't just shelter anymore. It was becoming a pulse. Later he heard a step. Not her, not outside. He turned, expecting silence. Found her shadow again. Not at the door this time, but just past it. 1 foot inside. She didn't approach. She studied. Her eyes moved slowly. Across the table, the wood stove, the tin cups, the window with the small crack in the top pane. She took in every object like it was a language she half remembered. Her head tilted toward the fire, then the ceiling, then the chair where his coat hung. But she didn't touch anything. Not the cabinets, not the knives, not even the meat jerky he'd left out. She just watched. Then, near the cot, she crouched. Her child was breathing evenly now, small ribs rising, the wool shirt rising with it. She reached into the pouch at her side, drew out something tiny, a shard of bark, dried. On it, a thumb smudge of crushed leaf. She placed it beside the fire without a sound, then stepped back. Calvin recognized some of it. Old mountain medicine, black cohosh, maybe yarrow, some root he couldn't name. He didn't thank her. Didn't have to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was deliberate. That night, after he'd fed the fire 3 times and checked the infant's breath 5, he noticed she hadn't moved from her place near the far wall. Not asleep, just still. Her eyes fixed out the window, toward the trees. He followed her line of sight. Darkness, still, but dense, like something out there had weight. She wasn't resting. She was guarding. Not from him, from something else. He got up quietly, poured 2 cups of water. 1 for him, 1 left near her, untouched. She didn't blink, but he knew she saw it. When the knock came, it wasn't loud, just one from deep in the trees. It sounded like something wooden striking earth. Not hollow, not warning. It was a call. She shifted, her shoulders squared, her hands braced against the floor. He recognized the moment. This wasn't fear. This was answer. They knew, somewhere out there, others like her, waiting, listening, not just for the child, but for the mark, the one he had wiped away. His throat tightened. He didn't regret the act, not the choice to save it. But something in the air told him that the mountain didn't forget the rules just because someone broke them kindly. The next morning, the world woke up with sun, not bright, but soft, slanting in past the evergreens like it was still unsure if winter was truly done. He opened the door. Cold breeze swept in, not bitter, not welcoming either, just a reminder. Things moved forward, whether they were ready or not. A soft knock, not from the woods, but from the side porch. He tensed, opened. Ruth Ann Miller stood there, cheeks pink from the cold, a half loaf of cornbread wrapped in flannel, and a sack of canned beans swinging from her wrist. "Well?" she said simply, eyes narrowing on his face. "You look like a man keeping a promise." He didn't answer, just took the bag. She didn't press. She never did. She stepped back down the stairs, careful, calm. Paused halfway. "Just holler if you need anything else. Roads are clear. Not many folks coming up this early in the season." He nodded, but his hand trembled slightly on the frame. She saw it, but said nothing. She turned and walked down the trail, her boots leaving small, neat prints in the thawing earth. He closed the door. Inside, the child had stirred. The rhythm on his knee resumed. Not for comfort. For memory. The fire burned steady now. But it wasn't the only thing keeping this place warm anymore. Outside, far along the tree line, a new set of tracks had appeared overnight. Larger, broader, planted wide. They didn't come close. They circled, then vanished into the mist. The cabin was no longer invisible. It was being watched, measured. And the child inside, it was no longer just a life saved. It was a decision made, and decisions have weight. By the time Calvin stepped out onto the porch, the woods had already changed. It wasn't something you could see all at once. It was in the way the birds had stopped singing mid-note, the way the breeze stilled just shy of the tree line, the way the pines, tall and steady, now seemed to lean inward as if listening. The footprints were back. Not hers, not Ember's. Others, too many to count. Some fresher than others. Some so wide they barely fit between the stones and split log path. They wrapped around the cabin in a perfect arc, not crossing the threshold. Like a silent court had assembled and now stood in witness. He didn't move right away. He just stood there, hands braced against the rough railing, watching the pattern curve through the frost-softened soil. Something about the shape felt ceremonial, not a warning, not a threat. A verdict, maybe. Or the start of one. Inside, Ember stirred. The little one had started crawling to the sound of the fire's crackle. Short bursts, small hands pressing into the cabin's wood floor, the rhythm still syncing with Calvin's tapping knee like it was born knowing that was safe. Holloway, the mother, hadn't left her position near the back window since midnight. She never seemed to sleep. Not fully, always watching. Always one breath away from stepping between danger and her child. But now her posture had shifted. Not tense, resolved, as if she knew what this morning meant. Calvin turned, met her gaze. No words passed, just understanding. He stepped back inside and closed the door behind him, fingers brushing the bolt, but not sliding it. She rose and walked to the center of the room. And for the first time since the ice, she looked tired. Not weak, just old in the way forests get old. Bearing too many seasons, too many scars. Then she knelt, slow, purposeful. She dipped one thick finger into a small pouch at her waist and brought out a smear of dark red clay. Rich, smelling faintly of iron and damp root. She reached up and pressed it to her own shoulder. A single line, then another. Crossed over it. A mark of guilt, not shame. Calvin didn't understand the ritual, not fully. But something about the way she moved, the stillness of her breathing, told him this wasn't just habit. She was taking the blame. For the erased mark, for letting him carry the child, for letting the cabin burn warm while the mountain watched. Calvin sat slowly, the way a man does when he realizes he's deeper into something than he ever meant to be. Ember crawled toward his leg and paused, tiny fingers brushing the edge of his jeans. She looked up with wide eyes, still, curious, unafraid. And then, beyond the ridge, a sound split the air. Not the gnarled knock of before. A sound with heat in it. A voice. Human. Rough. Over there, by that rise. Another voice. Closer. Tracks, big ones, still fresh. Calvin stood. The forest had two kinds of silence. the kind that protected, and the kind that judged. This was neither. This was the kind that came just before men with guns entered places they didn't belong. He crossed to the window and saw it. Down near the old stream bed, where the aspens started to thin, 2 trucks, old and rust-colored, parked between deadfall and slope. Men, 4, maybe 5, dressed for the woods, but not for survival. Dressed like people hunting stories. Or trophies. He didn't recognize them. Not from town. Probably from farther out, maybe Jasper, or down past 10 Mile. Not the worst sort, but not the kind to walk away from something worth money. One of them was pointing. Another held something long and silver, barrel gleaming like it wanted to speak first. Holloway moved behind him. She knew. Her body was different now. She stood like a creature who'd been through this once before, who'd lost something to men who didn't listen. Calvin's throat tightened. He turned, walked to the table, unfolded an old topographic map from the drawer. The ink was fading, but the roots were still clear. He traced a line with one finger, up the draw, past the broken footbridge, then west toward the inner ridge basin. A place no one but him had reason to know. A place even trail markers avoided now. He looked at her. "I can buy you time," he said. She didn't answer, just watched him. He gathered supplies quickly. A wrapped bundle of jerky, an old canvas sack, 2 canteens. He wasn't sure how much farther Ember could go, or if Holloway would let him carry her again, but he packed as if the choice might come. Then he paused. On the shelf above the stove was a tin box. Inside, an old harmonica, a broken watch, and a carved sliver of pine no larger than a coin. Smooth, with a spiral etched into the grain. It had belonged to his son, the one he never got to know. He tucked it into his breast pocket. Outside, the footsteps were closer. A shout, then silence. He opened the door, stepped out, not with fear, with the same slow calm he used when checking a washed-out road or clearing fallen limbs from the service line after a storm. He walked toward the ridge, waving once, deliberate, as if he were just a ranger on his morning sweep. The men saw him. One of them raised a hand in greeting, then narrowed his eyes. Calvin called out first. "Trail's washed out down here. You'll want to circle south if you're looking for anything but poison oak." The man nearest the truck stepped forward. Older, beard streaked with gray, broad chest. "You seen anything strange out here?" Calvin gave a practiced shrug. "Depends what you mean by strange. Saw a moose with 3 legs once. A few chuckled, not many." "You hear the stories?" the man asked. "Big one, real big. Something moving at night. We got a friend said he saw prints." Calvin's face didn't change. "Seen plenty of prints. Elk, bear, snowshoe hares with attitudes." One of the younger men stepped around him, eyes scanning the tree line. Another held up a phone, not recording, just reading something off it. Probably some forum thread, coordinates passed like rumors. Calvin had to move them. "Now, you boys want to see the bluff overlook? Best spot for tracks. 2 miles north. Sharp drop. Hard to miss." They hesitated. One looked toward the cabin, another toward the ridge. A crow screamed overhead, cutting the air clean in 2. Then one of the men nodded. "All right, show us." Calvin turned, walked slowly, led them down the path, away from the porch, away from the line of footprints circling like a judgment still waiting to be spoken. As he walked, he didn't look back, because he didn't have to. The sound of the woods changed behind him, just slightly. The wind picked up again, something unseen exhaled, and the mountain, just for a moment, seemed to shift its weight, waiting to see which way this would fall. The moon was still hanging low, and Calvin stepped back into the clearing. He moved carefully, boots thick with dew and soil. The men were gone, sent in the wrong direction hours earlier, but the risk lingered like smoke after a fire. Every twig he snapped underfoot felt louder than it should have. When the cabin came into view, he paused. The door was open. A narrow band of orange light spilled out across the porch floor. Inside, the wood stove still glowed. But something in the air had shifted. Not danger. Not yet. Readiness. He stepped up and saw them through the threshold. Holloway was crouched near the wall, packs laid out at her side, vines tied with moss for straps, water gourds hollowed from pine knots. The kind of gear made by creatures who'd never had use for tools until survival made it necessary. And Ember, little Ember, stood at the center of the room. Tiny feet planted wide apart, unsteady but determined. Not crawling, not being held, standing, his hands curled slightly at his sides. He didn't say a word. Holloway looked at him, then looked away. Not dismissive, not angry, just final. She was leaving, now, before anyone else climbed that hill, before the mountain court passed judgment, before Calvin's mercy pulled them all under. He took one step forward, and Ember turned to him, wide eyes, alert. She toddled, then walked. Small, wobbly steps across the floor, past the cot and the table and the boots left by the door. Straight to him. She pressed her forehead to his knee. Didn't cry, didn't whimper, just stood there. His hands hovered in the air, not touching her yet. Then slowly, he knelt and wrapped one arm around her small frame. She leaned into it, head tilted up toward his shoulder, and he knew she didn't want to go. But she would, if he said so. Behind him, Holloway was still watching, her breath even, her spine still like a mountain waiting to see how the river would flow. He stood again, Ember in his arms, carried her to the chair by the stove. Sat. The cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get once you stop fighting time. He looked down at her forehead, then over at the pouch Holloway had left near the fire. Half open. Inside, a small clay bundle. Red. Still soft. He dipped 2 fingers into it. Holloway rose. Not toward him, but toward her child. Calvin met her eyes for only a moment. A kind of permission moved between them. He touched the clay to his hand, then pressed it gently to Ember's forehead, right where the first mark had been, the one he'd wiped away. This one wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was an apology, and a promise. He felt the child's breath slow against his chest. Outside, something shifted. One deep sound, distant, yet certain. A single knock against wood, not echoing, not repeated. Like a door closing, or opening. Holloway's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. And then, without being told, Ember slid from his lap and walked across the room. Slow, barefoot. She stopped between them, turned, looked up at him. He didn't speak, didn't need to. She reached out one small hand and touched his chest, just once, where his heartbeat lived. Then turned back to her mother. Holloway lowered herself and gathered the child onto her side. Not cradled, not hidden. Carried. Together they crossed the threshold, but not quickly. Each step down the porch was deliberate, as if the very air was marking their passing. Calvin stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame. When they reached the edge of the trees, Holloway paused, turned slightly. Their eyes met one more time. He didn't wave. She didn't nod. But it was goodbye, just not the final kind. Then they were gone. The forest closed behind them, slow and sure. He stepped back inside, closed the door. The warmth from the fire still wrapped the room in breath and shadow. The clay pot still sat open. The rhythm in his chest slowed. And somewhere out there, where the roots tangled deep and old laws whispered through leaves older than memory, the mountain had made space, but only for now. By the time the sun broke over the treetops, the light had changed. Not just the sky, but everything beneath it. The forest wasn't green the way it was in spring. It had turned. You could see it in the moss, a little duller. In the edges of the leaves, gold threading through the veins like time reminding things it was almost time to fall. Calvin led the way. He didn't say much, didn't need to. Every footstep was a conversation, every snapped twig was a decision. The trail ahead wasn't marked on any map, not even the old paperins pinned to Forest Service walls back in town. It was a path only memory could hold. Routes made long ago when he was younger and thought these woods would always belong to him. Now he shared them with something older, something quieter. Behind him, Holloway moved with the surety of a creature who belonged. Not rushed, not afraid, just deliberate. Ember clung to her side, riding tucked into the curve of her hip, alert but calm. Her small head turned every so often toward Calvin, watching the space between them like it might mean something more than distance. They moved like that for hours, down narrow ravines cut by meltwater in seasons past, across fallen trees flattened like broken bridges, over moss-slick stones that shone like glass in the morning dew. Calvin used the sun and shadow to find his way, and Holloway used something else, something born into her bones. When he paused to check a ridge's line, she paused too. When he shifted direction because of the wind, her head had already turned. Somewhere in that silence, they became a rhythm. But the world outside didn't stop. Calvin heard the first signs just after noon. Far off, over a draw thick with alder, came the distant crack of bootsteps on dry brush. Not deer, not elk, men. He crouched behind a rise and signaled her without thinking. One hand raised, the other flat, pointed away. She understood, moved without sound. Ember's breath stilled in the crook of her shoulder. He slid down behind a boulder and watched. 3 of them, not the same as before. Different faces, but same tools, same eyes scanning the trees like they had a right to whatever they found. The tallest carried a rifle slung over one shoulder and a pair of binoculars in the other. The youngest had a camera swinging from his neck, not even raised, just hanging there, waiting for proof. They stopped not 30 yards away, where a soft patch of mud held a partial print. One of them knelt. "Jesus," he whispered. "That's not a bear." Calvin didn't breathe, didn't move. The man took a photo, then stood. "Trail bends left," one said. "Let's follow it down." They moved on, not toward the cabin now, but toward where Holloway had passed, toward the very route she'd chosen. But not quite, because she had done something Calvin hadn't expected. She doubled back, not through panic, but intention. As if she knew how to lay false trails. As if she'd learned not just how to walk these woods, but how to mislead in them. She was protecting him now. They waited until the sound of the men faded, then moved again. Faster now. Not running, but urgent. The way people move when the weight of something invisible is pressing just behind them. Calvin led them through a side canyon, steep and thick with undergrowth. His boots slipped on the wet rock. He caught himself once, twice, but the third time his knee buckled. A low grunt escaped his throat. He dropped. The pain was sharp, dull after. He tried to stand, but his right leg didn't hold. Holloway turned immediately. She laid Ember down at the base of a cedar, wrapped tight in bark and moss. Then she came to him. He reached for a root, tried to pull himself up. His teeth clenched, breath tight. But her hand was already there, large, warm, calloused. She slipped it under his arm and lifted, not like a nurse, but like a sister, a comrade, like someone who had carried weight before. He steadied, limped. She stayed beside him, step for step, never once letting go. They moved like that for another hour, maybe 2, long enough for the light to soften, long enough for the mountain to exhale. Then they reached the basin. It wasn't marked by anything man had made. No signs, no stones, no trailhead. Just a clearing where the trees grew tall and wide enough to part the sky. The air here smelled different, older, like something sacred had passed through but didn't stay. Holloway stopped at the edge. Calvin did too. They waited. The forest didn't move. Then, out of the hush, a shape stepped forward. Not her, another. Taller, older, hair grayer than bark, a face more human than ape, more weathered than wild. Then another shape, and another. They came not with weapons or calls, but with stillness. A ring formed around the clearing, not tight, not aggressive, just presence. Holloway stepped forward with Ember. The child stirred, reached up, touched her mother's face. And then the oldest stepped forward, a figure with eyes like fog on deep water. He moved slow, with reverence. stopped before Calvin, held something in his palm, a stone. Small, polished, etched with 3 shallow lines. Nothing fancy, no gold, no mysticism. He placed it in Calvin's hand, then stepped back. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. This was a marker. Not of ownership, not of debt, of recognition. The wind turned gently, brushing Calvin's face. He looked down at Ember one last time. She looked up. Her hand rose, touched his cheek. Soft, quick, final. Then Holloway turned, and they left. The circle broke just long enough to let them pass, then reformed, then vanished. The forest swallowed them the way rivers swallow rain. Calvin didn't follow. He stayed, one hand curled tight around the stone in his palm. And behind him, through branches still trembling from the passage of giants, came the echo of voices, human. Closer than before. He didn't move. Not yet. The air had changed again, not like a storm coming, or snow pressing down. It was quieter than that, like the forest had taken one deep breath and finally let it go. The kind of hush that only comes after something holy has passed through a place and left behind the weight of silence. The cabin stood still beneath the shifting gold of early fall. Red ferns curled near the porch. Pine cones cracked open in the warmth of mid-morning sun. From the outside, it looked the same. Rough logs, smoke-stained windows. That slight sag in the roof line Calvin always meant to fix. But inside, it wasn't the same. Not anymore. He moved slower these days. Not from age. From something else. A softness that hadn't been there before. The kind that came from letting go. The stove was cold. He didn't light it. Didn't need to. His body still held enough of the fire from what had come before. Calvin poured coffee into a chipped mug and stepped onto the porch. He sat in the old rocker, the one Ruth Ann had told him was bad on his back. He watched the tree line like a man who had learned not to expect anything, but knew enough to still hope. She'd come by again a few weeks back. Ruth Ann, with more preserves and that quiet look of hers that said she didn't need to ask. She saw it in his eyes, that something had been mended. "You've got a steadiness in your face again," she'd said, handing him a jar of blackberry jam. Like a man who finally forgave the clock. He didn't answer, just nodded. That day, after she left, he took down the map pinned to the wall. The one with the ridge paths, the hidden springs, the deer trails that even the locals didn't know how to find anymore. He rolled it tight, stepped out back, and lit a match, watched it burn slow in the fire pit. Not out of regret, out of love. There are some places too sacred to be followed, even by good men. The hunters had moved on, maybe because they got cold, maybe because they found something louder to chase, or maybe they just felt it, what Calvin now knew down in his marrow, that the mountain made its own choices. That night, when the fire had died low and the cabin was still, he'd reached for the smooth stone left in his coat pocket, the one marked by a hand older than any language. He held it to his chest and closed his eyes. He never told anyone about the gift. Never showed the lines to anyone else. Some stories don't belong in newspapers. In the weeks that followed, he changed in quiet ways. He helped rebuild the neighbor's fence, even though he hadn't spoken to the man in 4 years. He fixed the railing on Ruth Ann's back steps. When the Barker's dog slipped into the gorge behind the old mill, Calvin didn't hesitate. Climbed down, slow and steady, one hand bleeding from the shale, and brought the trembling mutt back up like it was nothing. Folks noticed, but no one asked. They just let him be. Every now and then, someone new came through town, asking questions about creatures, about tracks, about noises that didn't match anything on the guidebooks. Calvin listened, sometimes pointed toward the wind, sometimes toward nowhere at all. The cabin stayed quiet, until one afternoon, late in October, when the sky was low and the leaves fell in slow spirals. He'd been raking, just habit, when he saw it. Not movement, a shape, at the edge of the trail. Just a print, one, small, pressed into the mud like a whisper. He didn't call out, didn't run, didn't follow. He just stood there, then walked inside, sat on the edge of the bed, and with hands that had steadied broken trees, soothed wild things and buried old grief. He reached for the folded blanket on the chair, smoothed it out, tucked the corners just so, then sat still and whispered to the empty room. "You were on time." Nothing answered, but he didn't need it to, because some things don't echo. They settle, they stay. They change the shape of your quiet, and when they leave, they don't take the warmth with them. They leave it folded, waiting, just in case. Duam ketuk. Juandan rieng shokan. Gia YouTube kuaban. Kindness isn't always loud. It doesn't always win, and it doesn't always leave behind proof. But sometimes it leaves a blanket folded on a chair, or a mark returned on a forehead, or a moment where a creature turns back before vanishing into the trees. And when that happens, when something chooses not to run, but to trust, it reminds us that being human isn't the only way to be good. Sometimes the wild has a better memory than we do. Sometimes the mountain forgives more than the world ever will. And if you've ever felt like you missed your chance, like you arrived too late to matter, remember, showing up when it finally counts can still be holy. Now, I want to know something. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? What's your name, friend? Could this story have happened near where you live? Or maybe in your memory? Leave me a comment. Tell me where you're from, who you are, or who you would have handed that blanket to. And if this story moved you, even just a little, tap like, subscribe. We're building something here. A quiet place for stories that still believe in kindness. And somewhere out there, maybe Ember is still listening. Maybe you are too. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones that end in triumph or tragedy. They're the ones that unfold quietly, through slow choices, small kindnesses, and the weight of simply staying when it would have been easier to walk away. Because in a world that constantly demands noise, the most sacred moments often speak in silence. In the pause between footsteps, in the warmth of a fire someone else kept burning, in the way the earth remembers what we thought it forgot. This story wasn't about heroes or monsters. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about balance, about the way life answers back when we listen long enough, about how mercy isn't weakness, and how gentleness, in the right moment, can be more powerful than fear or force. Sometimes redemption doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in showing up after all this time. It comes in holding your ground or letting go when the moment asks. It comes in a breath shared, a danger faced together, a line that isn't crossed, not because it can't be, but because someone chooses not to. And maybe that's the point. Maybe being good doesn't mean being right all the time. Maybe it just means showing up with your hands open. Maybe it means carrying what you broke and still choosing to mend it, even if nobody's watching. Because the world won't always repay your kindness, but it remembers it. And sometimes, when the wind shifts, when the fire's low, when no one else is around, that kindness comes back. Not as a reward, but as a reminder. You were never too late. You were exactly on time, and even if no one else saw it, you made something whole again. If this story spoke to something inside you, I want to invite you to pause here with me and share what it stirred. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. What part of this story stayed with you? Or maybe, what you needed to hear most tonight? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's build a space where quiet things matter, where stories heal, where we remember that compassion still has a place in this world. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing, not just for the next story, but to be part of a community that listens deeply, feels fully, and believes still in the quiet power of kindness. Thank you for being here. You matter more than you know.